Christmas already, right? Kids, just to warn you, if you've got kids in the kids' church, they're talking about Christmas. Follow that star is the theme today. So if you've got kids in the kids' church, talk to them about that this afternoon. If you've got young people in the youth work, have a chat with them about Esther as well. What amazing things to really dig into. But today, in the main service, or the adult bit of the service, we're going to be digging into Philippians for the last time, for the fifth time and for the last time. I'm just going to read the passage first. We'll talk about it a bit, we'll pray, and we'll do some more worship. Does that sound okay? Great, let's do it. So Philippians chapter 4, verses 10 to 13. Hopefully it's on behind me. It says, I rejoiced greatly in the Lord that at last you renewed your concern for me. Indeed, you were concerned, but you had no opportunity to show it. I'm not saying this because I'm in need, for I have learned to be content whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do all this through him who gives me strength. So that's our passage this morning. I should have said, I'm Paul. I'm a member of the leadership team here at Rock+Redeemer. And it's a real privilege to preach on Philippians. We've been in the second half of Philippians. We've been looking at chapters 3 and 4. And we've done that for 5 talks. This is the 5th. And in case you've missed any of those, Philippians was written by Paul, not me, the Apostle Paul, during his time in a Roman prison. And he's writing it to a church that he helped to plant. And you can tell all the way through the letter, he's quite affectionate towards them. He really likes the Philippians. And in these chapters and talks, we've covered how to chase something real, that we should consider fake religiosity as rubbish, and how Paul talked about pressing on towards the goal for which God has called me heavenward in Jesus Christ. We've talked about there being 2 different ways of seeing the world, and that our citizenship is in heaven. We've considered how to have joy, and looked at that famous verse, rejoice in the Lord always. I will say it again, rejoice. And we've also looked at how to have peace. I hope you've had a very peaceful week since. How to have peace. And that verse, which Steve put into a lot of context for us, do not be anxious about anything. And in all of this, Paul's giving us some amazing advice for life there. But he's really clear that he's not there yet. God is clearly at work in his life. This is the Apostle Paul we're talking about. And he's been transformed to be more like Jesus, but even he isn't there yet. And I hope that a simple takeaway from some of these talks, and hopefully for most of the talks at Rock+Redeemer, is that if you've accepted Jesus into your life, there's nothing left to do to be right with God. Jesus has done it all. But after a lifetime of religious perfectionism, Paul had learned that on the road to Damascus. He didn't need to do anything else when Jesus broke into his life. However, after receiving salvation by grace on his journey, Paul's still pushing into something. He's still pushing to become more like Jesus. So we accept Jesus into our lives. Our sin is dealt with and we're justified, but the work of sanctification is a lifetime endeavor. That's just a fancy word for saying if you're a Christian, God is working in you right now to be more like him. We started with this question a few sermons ago. We started with the question, where do you want to be 3 years from now? And I guess I'd ask that again this morning. Hopefully, we're now saying, actually, we'd really love to chase after something real, that we want more joy in our lives, that we want to have a little bit more peace. I certainly want all of those things. And that's the work of sanctification in our lives. And I hope we've been really clear in this series that those things aren't about what happened to us. Being rich, healthy, or comfortable, those things aren't really signs of sanctification or God's favor. We want to become more like Jesus. And it's worth remembering that in Jesus' life and his ministry, he was far from comfortable, far from wealthy, and he ended up in being executed by the Romans. We want to be more like him. Gosh, what a call. And even in those most challenging of circumstances, he was full of joy and full of peace. So we land today on our last talk on Philippians, and Paul is wrapping up his letter. There's some great practical advice in there for the church in Philippi. Things like reminding people to be of the same mind, He wants them to have unity and not division. So there's loads of practical bits in there that we're not going to get time to talk all about. So I'd really encourage you. It takes about 5 or 10 minutes to read Philippians. It's only 4 chapters long. Please do give it a read, all in one go. That's how it was intended to be read. But as a final sign-off, Paul returns to the same theme that he started the letter, and that's around thanks for some gifts that have been sent to him. The book of Philippians is basically an extended thank you letter. And he starts like this. I'll read it again. I rejoiced greatly in the Lord that at last you renewed your concern for me. Indeed, you were concerned, but you had no opportunity to show it. I'm not saying this because I'm in need. So he's been sent a gift of help, and also, we think, a financial gift, and he's incredibly grateful for that. And it's caused him to rejoice. But actually, he's primarily saying that actually the gift is good for the Philippians. It's great for them that they've done it. He makes it really clear, in fact, that he's sort of fine either way. But it's brilliant for them that actually they're the givers and they get a blessing from that. It's also that word concern. It's not a one-time thing. It's more of a heart and a mindset towards him. He's so very grateful that they have concern for him, not just as a one-time thing, but an ongoing thing. But when you take a step back, it's a bit of a weird sentence in a thank you letter. He's basically saying, thank you so much for this gift and your ongoing support. I'm incredibly grateful. But you know what? I'm not really in need. I'd honestly be fine without your money. And I'd like to test that sentence for a second here. Is Paul really not in need? And I just want to give a bit of a brief summary, what he's been through in his last 3 years before he wrote this letter. 3 years before, he'd just finished his 3rd missionary journey, and he'd been on the road for 4 or 5 years. He'd been to Macedonia, to Ephesus. He'd been to Troas. There's that famous story of someone falling asleep during one of his sermons. That's a good message for preachers there. Don't preach too long. He fell asleep, and he died on the crash down, and they had to be brought back to life. He's been in Caesarea, and he's caused a riot there. He's gone back to Jerusalem, and he's fell out with other leaders in the early church. He's been writing letters all over the place. He's ended up under house arrest in Caesarea, and he's been transported over to Rome to prison. I'd say he needed a bit of help. In 2 Corinthians, he writes, again, not just about the last 3 years, but other things he's experienced. 39 lashes on 5 different occasions. He's been beaten with rods 3 times. He's been stoned and thought to be dead. He's been shipwrecked, not once, not twice, but 3 times. He's spent a day and a night adrift at sea after one of his shipwrecks, and he's been through a multitude of dangers, rivers, robbers, multitude of enemies. I'd say he needed a bit of help. And I'd be sending a letter, not just back to the Philippians to say thank you so much. I would be writing to all the other churches and say, look what the Philippians have done. I could really do with a bit of help. It's been a rough 3 years. But in the next sentence, he doesn't do that. He says that he doesn't really need any help, really. He's very grateful, but he doesn't really need it because he is perfectly content. Perfectly content. Would you be content in those circumstances? And I just want to camp on that word today, contentment. And that's going to be the focus of our time this morning. And I've got a question for us. 3 years from now, will you be more content? What could make us more content? Traditional answers might be something along these lines. Perhaps there might be a family situation. If that was resolved or improved, that might make us more content. For some of us, if we've not met them yet, it's meeting Mr. Right or Mrs. Right, that might make us more content. It might be finances. Actually, if I could just have a little bit more, I'd be content. It could be a job. If I could just be a bit more fulfilled in what I'm doing in my day-to-day, perhaps then I'd be a bit more content. Perhaps my mental or my physical health. If I lost a few more pounds, if I worked on my own well-being a bit more, perhaps I'd be a bit more content. And of course, all of those things, they're all good things, most of them. But the question is, will it ever be enough? If we're just thinking along those lines, will we ever be content? Another quick thought on contentment. I think I shared in my last talk, I had a tough year last year, particularly at work, and finished the summer term. I'm a teacher, quite stressed and pretty wound up. And I certainly wouldn't have described myself as content. In fact, I often start these periods of holiday. I don't know about you. When you start a period of time off, you sometimes need that decompression time to feel a bit more content. Perhaps others resonate with that. So I was keen to use the summer break to seek out that sense of peace and contentedness. And I just got a few photos for what I did to try and go about that. The first thing I did is I had been sort of slightly dreaming and fantasizing about wandering off into the wilderness on my own. It's a bit of a sign of people were sort of at me all day long. And I did it, so that's me in the wilderness all on my own. Didn't speak to anyone for 24 hours, and that, you know what, that helped. That helped. But I wouldn't have described myself yet as completely content. So obviously, another thing that brings me a lot of joy and contentment is spending time with my family. There's my 2 boys on holiday, and of course that certainly helps. I spent time with friends, sometimes involving beer, not always, and also spent time with my dog. If you're after spending time with a being who's incredibly content, spend time with a dog. They've got a great life. And that all helped, obviously, enormously. Perhaps we'll go back to the scripture now. Thank you. However, I was surprised at how, after a period of stress, it took a really long time to get back to that place of feeling more contented. And I'm pleased to report I do feel a lot more content. But I don't know how much time I'd need off. I mean, it took me a few weeks to unwind. I don't know how much time I'd need off if I'd had the experiences that Paul had had. I think he's well overdue some kind of sabbatical, which is perhaps why we might be understandably a bit surprised when we read Paul's next statement from prison in Rome. He says, "For I have learned to be content," this is verse 11. "I've learned to be content whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want." Now, of course, the question that we've got for Paul this morning is, Paul, what's the secret? Tell us about that, please. We'd love to know. So let's unpick that a little bit, shall we? There's a couple of references to the word learned. Have you spotted that? In the Greek, there's actually 2 different words, which is perhaps worth noting. Verse 11 is this idea of I've learned from experience. I've been through some stuff, and I've learned some lessons from that. Whereas verse 12, learned the secret, is actually all one word. And it's a bit like, this isn't a great translation, but perhaps it speaks to the heart of it. It's a bit like, that's what it is. It's the first one. You know that bit where you finally find, that sock you've been missing? Or, that's where it is. He's learned some tough life lessons, and that's part of the answer. And he's also had a bit of a revelation as well. I've learned. So what's the contentment that he's talking about? The word contentment is autarkus, where we get our English word autarky, which is about self-sufficiency. Which makes me think of, I recently watched an episode of Grand Designs, where, I don't know if any other fans in the room want to see, okay. There's an episode recently where a family bought a patch of land in the middle of the forest, and they built a house that was entirely off-grid. Beginning of the summer, I'd have really gone for that. Entirely off-grid, no water, no electricity. They had to produce everything themselves, and had life on their own in the forest. That was the idea. Interestingly, their teenage kids weren't all that keen on the idea. It's not quite what's being expressed here. The word around contentment is more like whatever situation I end up in, it's not like I'm just relying on myself. It's just whatever, regardless of the situation, I'm okay with that. God, I trust you. That's enough for me. If God is blessing me, brilliant, okay. If God seems to be holding something back or allowing a bad situation to continue, I'll trust him in that too. It's self-sufficient in the sense that I don't look at the world around me for my contentment. I find that in Jesus, regardless of what's going on around me. And this perhaps runs a bit counter to some of the ideas that we have about contentment in the world. Some people will tell you you can find contentment by emptying yourself. Yeah, empty your mind, empty your houses from all the rubbish you've built up over the years, and you'll find contentment. Perhaps do a bit more yoga. Of course, capitalism tells us that we should find contentment by getting more and more and more and more. We're about to enter the Christmas season, and we'll get that message over and over again. There's even perhaps a slightly healthier message, but it's also not what Paul's talking about here. That if I can just have just enough, then I'll be content. But we shouldn't be contented because we have a lot or because we lack things, because it's raining outside or because it's sunny. That's not the reason for our contentment, according to Paul. It's all about being content in God's providence, his guiding hand over our lives and over creation, regardless of what's going on around us. And that might lead us to consider the question, are we content with what God has given us, the situations he's put us in, and the purposes to which he's called us? Some of this reminds me a bit of that story that is in the Gospels about the rich man and Jesus. Do you remember that one? In Mark 10. I'll skip a few verses, but it'll give you the idea. It says, as Jesus was starting out on his way to Jerusalem, a man came running up to him, knelt down and asked, good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus, of course, says, why do you call me good? Only God is good. We could get more into that. We'll do that another time. But to answer your question, you know the commandments and do as they say. And the man replies, I've obeyed all the commandments since I was young, so he's very pleased with himself. And Jesus says, fine, brilliant, well done. Go and sell all your possessions and give the money to the poor. And you'll have treasure in heaven. Then come follow me. And I don't think, it's worth thinking about that story for a second in light of what Paul's saying here. The purpose of that story isn't to say that to be content or to be right with God, you need to give away everything you've got. He wasn't content in his wealth, was he? Otherwise, he wouldn't have been coming to Jesus to say, what more do I need to do? How like that is us? How much like that are we sometimes? In enormous wealth, in terms of we live in a wealthy country generally. Most of us are blessed to have our needs met. And we say, well, what more? What more? What more? He wasn't content in his wealth. But I'd suggest he wouldn't have been content in his poverty either. Of course, the story isn't about poverty being the secret to contentment. It's about surrender. It's about saying, I'm going to follow Jesus regardless of what's going on around me. Contentment is being surrendered to the will of God in every situation. Paul says, again, I've learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. And I want to be really clear. I've tried hard to express this well, but grab me afterwards if you don't think I did. I want to be really clear that not every situation you find yourself in, of course, is good. We live in a fallen world, a world where God's kingdom hasn't been fully realized yet. And although God is ultimately in charge, and he will work things for good in the end, awful things still happen. Some of us know that, well, far better than I do. And I don't believe that these bad things are caused by God, or even that God allows them to happen because he wants us to learn something from them. If you've ever had that message, or you're going through this terrible situation so God can teach you something, I don't think that's always true. And is generally sort of pretty poor theology. You might find yourself in all manner of dreadful situations, and Paul is saying, and he's not saying that every situation is good, or that we shouldn't do anything about the injustice, suffering, and evil we find around us. In fact, the whole message of the gospel is totally the opposite of that. We've seen this in our theme of joy too. I don't always rejoice in my situation. I rejoice in the Lord. I don't find contentment in my situation. I find it in God and my trust for him. For Paul, I wonder what he was thinking about when he was writing these words. Perhaps he was thinking about his own experiences, being content. Perhaps he's thinking about the time when he's clinging onto the wreckage of a ship for a day and a night. And I'm sure in that situation, he was feeling pretty scared, no doubt very cold, and thinking about his possible imminent death. Perhaps he's feeling very similar, actually, when he was stoned in Lystra, left for dead, in extreme amounts of pain, probably, and suffering deeply. Perhaps we might think about the life of Jesus, too. I think we can only imagine that Jesus must have been incredibly content. But still, he mourns and weeps over the death of Lazarus. He prays to God in the Garden of Gethsemane before his arrest. He sweats blood, and he says, "Father, if you're willing, take this cup from me," though importantly, "yet not my will, but yours be done." Now, the sort of contentment that Paul's describing isn't sort of a Zen-like acceptance of fate, that in every situation, we're just incredibly calm, doing 7-Eleven breathing. Although that's nice when we do that. He's not saying that. It's okay to feel things deeply. In fact, I think that's quite right, actually, that we should feel things deeply when times are tough. Paul and Jesus, and we're trying to become more like Jesus, they certainly did. But still, despite that, still coming back to trust God, that's Paul's secret to contentment. And when he's saying in any and every situation, for him, that's not a cheap throwaway line. He's learnt that through experience. Before we finish, another couple of things I'd just like to address about contentment is around historic regrets. That can sometimes make us feel discontented. And I don't know about you, but I often have little thoughts that pop into my mind about past mistakes I've made. Often when I'm not really expecting them and I'm not really thinking about those events. And it's often silly mistakes, small things that didn't really matter in the past. And without over-spiritualizing these, I do think there's an element around the devil trying to wear us down with our past mistakes. And I think that's worth thinking about with Paul too. He made his fair share of mistakes. But he still talks about contentment. I'm sure you remember that Paul was one of the main persecutors of the church. He did some appalling things. He killed Stephen, who was one of, I'm not sure if God has favorites, but if he did, Stephen would probably be one of them. He might well have been thinking that he wished that had never happened. And he's probably carrying a lot more regret than most of us carry. But Paul's still able to say that whatever he's done, he's content. There's something in there about knowing that God has dealt with it. He can be content. And I don't know if anyone this morning needs to hear that, but if you're still holding on to something that's getting in the way of your contentment, I'd encourage you to give it to God again this morning. The last verse, which we'll finish on, is a bit of a fridge magnet classic. I can do all this through him who gives me strength. I don't know if anyone's got a fridge magnet with this on. There's obviously some very good stuff in there. It's the Bible. But I would say, what's it not saying? Listen carefully. I don't think it's saying, I can do all things through him who gives me strength. Which, of course, you're going to be thinking, well, wait, that's exactly what it says. But I would suggest there are some things that aren't going to happen, even if we're armed with this verse. If you're a Spurs fan, if you are sitting there thinking, armed with this verse, I can do all things through God's strength, they're still not going to win the Premier League, I'm sorry. I can go in to a Saturday or Sunday morning, or any morning of the week really, armed with this verse and say, I can do all things in God who gives me strength, and my kids still aren't going to get out the door within 5 minutes of me asking them to leave. It's just not going to happen. As ever with the Bible, context, of course, is key. It's all about contentment. What he's saying is, we can learn to be content. It feels difficult, but we can learn to be content even in the most difficult of circumstances because it's God who gives us the strength for that. And this isn't just about a passive acceptance of our fate. It's a positive choice to be content with God's will in our lives. It's also not a passive sense of there's nothing God's ever going to do about it. He might well break in and change things. But even if he doesn't do that immediately in a way that we'd love him to, we still say, God, we trust you, and we choose to positively engage in that. I'm just going to finish by reading the passage again, and then I'm going to pray. So Paul said, I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I've learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do all this through him who gives me strength. And Father, we lift up those verses to you this morning, and we thank you so much for them. And whether we're sitting here this morning thinking, actually, I am in plenty, or sitting here this morning thinking, I am in want, regardless of our situation, God. And some of us might need to pray for more strength to say this than others. We say we trust you with it, God. That we're content. We're content that you have control over our lives. And we give that to you. We're content with your will in our lives. And we just thank you so much that we get to work alongside you, God, in the work of the kingdom. Just pray for any members of the congregation this morning, God, who where we're feeling it hard to reach that sense of contentment, Lord. Just we lift up those situations to you now, God, whether those are things we're walking through right now or things that keep on getting dragged up from the past. God, we lift those up to you and we say, we trust you, we love you, and we give our lives to you. Amen.